Look at you. Good. Yeah, I like your Andy Cap hat. You've heard of Andy Cap, yeah? Okay. A couple of those. I like those. Well, let's to it because I'm already 12 minutes late, and I got 15 minutes, so you know how that works. Take this all the way to 7. Oh, I won't take you that long. All right, let's pray. Father, thank you for getting me here safely. Thank you for Brother Todd and Sam, all that they mean to me, and continue to bless these good folks, help them to grow in grace, and keep going forward until you return in Christ. Amen. 3 Wednesdays ago, I started a 3-part series, and I was explaining the 3 parts of a Jewish wedding. You say, well, how does that apply to us? In every way. It applies to our own marriage to the Lord. I don't know if you know that. You view what a Jewish wedding is, and it looks exactly how our marriage is going to be to Christ. You say, well, I'm already married to Christ. No, you're not. You're just engaged. You say, oh, no, I got saved. Oh, I don't doubt you got saved. But that's the contract part. That's the engagement. That's not the marriage. The marriage doesn't come until he shows up. I mean, how can you have a marriage if you have a bride and not a groom? So the marriage takes place at the second coming of Christ. We're not married yet. We're just engaged. We talked about that engagement period 2 Wednesdays ago. Last Wednesday, we actually talked about the marriage part, the second coming, if you remember, okay? Tonight, we're going to continue the second part. You say, why not just give us the third part, the supper? You'll enjoy the marriage supper and what that all entails, but you really need to grasp talking about the second coming of Christ. The second part of the wedding is the torchlight parade. Jesus explained that, and I explained this to you last Wednesday. Explained that in Matthew chapter 25, and we'll get to that here in a moment. But it's talking about the 10 virgins. 5 had oil, brought oil in the lamp, the other 5 didn't, and there was this torchlight parade through the streets by the bridegroom and his groomsmen, which in this case pictures the angels. Who's going to return when Christ returns with him? The angels, okay? And so he's coming up the street, and he's announcing his coming. His coming. And that's how the bride knows he's coming. There are announcements to that coming, and we're going to talk about some of those announcements. Turn to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Look at verses 1 and 2. This should be familiar territory to you. Paul said this. He said, but of the times and the seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you. Let me just say something right here. The majority, and this, the majority of Christians today, not the minority, the majority, have no idea he's coming. They hear about it, but they don't want to hear about it. I've had Christians tell me left and right, and I'm in contact with a lot of them. Oh, I don't really want to hear that about his coming. I got too many things to do. You mean you're not ready for the marriage? And that's what it comes down to. They're ignorant of this part of the marriage. They're not. They think they're already married to the Lord. No, this is just the engagement period. The marriage is when the bridegroom shows up. If the bridegroom doesn't show up, you don't have a marriage. But of the times and seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you. Wouldn't you have loved to sit under Paul 2,000 years ago? For yourselves know perfectly, Paul said, I already taught you this stuff, that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. And that's going to take us directly to the wedding. You say, why? Because when Jesus talked about his second coming, it says at midnight. A time when it's not expected, but a time when the marriage takes place. Notice Matthew 25, 1 through 6, and we'll jump right into this. I know I read this to you last week, but this kind of gives you an idea, again, of where we're headed. Verse 1, then shall the kingdom of heaven, Jesus said, be likened unto 10 virgins, which took their lamps and went forth to meet the bridegroom. Now, how did they know to meet the bridegroom? Look at me. There had to be some kind of announcement. He's coming. We can hear him. We can see his lights. They're in the distance, but we can see him. And now we can hear him. Well, what are you hearing? That'll determine for you and I how close he actually is. And 5 of them were wise, 5 were foolish. They that were foolish took their lamps and took no oil with them at all. Of course, oil is a picture of the Holy Spirit. So this is talking about, and watch this, this is talking about unsaved people who have been invited to the marriage. They've been invited to be a part of it. But they never invited Christ into their lives. So they never got the oil in them. Oil in you. It says, they that were foolish took their lamps and took no oil with them, but the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. While the bridegroom tarried, while he was just down the street, if you would, they all slumbered and slept. Wasn't important to them. Here it is. Verse 6, and at midnight, there it is right there, midnight, there was a cry, an announcement. You could hear it. You are the bride of Christ. We are as the church. We are the bride of Christ, and we ought to be able to hear these announcements of his coming. There's a cry. There's announcements being made. And Christians have no idea how close he actually is. Oh, we expected him in 2009. We expected him in 2012. Well, you know what? You did a good thing by expecting him. Always looking forward to his return. Always. And now more than ever. Why? Well, you'll see. Because the cries that are being made are deafening. Folks, he's not 2 blocks away. Most Christians would disagree with that. But that's because, number one, they're probably not excited about his return. But number 2, they're not listening for the announcement. It says, and at midnight there was a cry or an announcement made, behold, the bridegroom cometh, go ye out to meet him. The torchlight parade, according to Christ himself, is always preceded by announcements of its arrival. He just didn't do this. He just didn't, have a little old candle and he was tiptoeing towards the bride's house at night. Nobody could hear him. No one knew there was an announcement. No. He brought torchlights so they could see him blocks away coming. Not only did he have torchlights, but he had announcements. There was cries. He's on his way. He's here. So, is the bridegroom just up the street or is he still blocks away? That's always indicated by the cries that have already been heard. You say, how many of these cries, I call them indicational proofs, have already been heard, and how many are there? If you want to know if the bridegroom is just up the street, or still many blocks away, if you would, then you need to know what to listen for. You say, what should I listen for? I want you to write these 10 dates down. Do this for yourself. You say, well, what are these dates going to indicate? It's going to indicate how close he actually is. Dates? Absolutely. See if you're ready or really listening for the cry of his arrival. Number 1, 1948. Of course, everybody knows 1948. Number 2, 1936. What? 12 years earlier than that? Oh, my goodness. Oh, that was a heralding time. Number 3, 1957. What happened in 1957? Oh. Number 4, 1939. Say, you're jumping all over the place. Yeah, but notice we're only 70 years away. Every one of these dates are 70 years and less, if you would. The second, I give that to you, 1936. Number 3, 1957. Number 4, 1939. Number 5, 1945. Number 6, 1936. Number 7, 1945. Number 8, 1967. Of course, that should be familiar to you. Number 5, 1945. Number 6, 1936. Number 7, 1945. Again, there's 2 of them. 2 events, big time, took place in 1945. The year World War II ended. 2 humongous events, telling us the bridegroom is just up the street. Number 8, 1967. Number 9, this was big. They're all big, but this was big. 1990s. Say 1990 what? The entire decade of 1990. Number 10, 2017. Just 3 years ago. Boy, you ought to know what that is. Some guy texted me today, a good Christian brother, and he goes to church in Oak Cliff, and he said, "Brother Brad, da-da-da-da-da." And he said, "Yeah, da-da-da-da-da-da." And he said, "I never saw that." But you're going to see it. Say, why? Because you need to listen for these cries. They've already been cried. Nobody's listening. Obviously, we're going to give you the first one tonight. And for the next 10 Wednesdays, I'll give you another one, and another one. I could give you all 10 tonight, but what good would that be if we're not listening anyway? Number 1, the rebirth and rebudding of the nation of Israel, 1948. You say, well, you kind of talked about that last week. Folks, that's the one that was yelling the loudest out of all 10. That's the one we take for granted, and we shouldn't. You realize Christ can't return without Israel being a nation? Billy Graham said this. I'll quote it later, but he said this. He says, "While my mother was alive, she always looked forward every day of her life for the second coming." But this was before 1948. He said, now that 1948 has taken place, he said, he's just around the corner. That was in 1948. You said that was 70 years ago. Yeah, but 70 years to you and I is a drop in the bucket to God. Our time is not his time. You say, well, then this thing could be another 70 or 100 years. Impossible. Because these other ones have come into play as well, screaming at the world. You say, well, how come Christians aren't listening? Because it's at midnight when he comes. Who stays awake till midnight? Christians slumber and sleep, and they're doing it today. That's why the majority, and I mean this, the majority of Christians, at least in this country, are completely unaware of how close we actually are. William F. Albright, professor of Semitic languages at Johns Hopkins University, said this. He says, there is no other phenomenon in history quite as extraordinary as the unique event represented by the restoration of Israel. At no other time in world history, so far as it is known, has a people been destroyed and then come back after a lapse of time and reestablished itself. It is utterly out of the question to seek a parallel for the reoccurrence of Israel's restoration after 2,500 years of former history. There is no parallel. There is no nation on the face of the earth that ever disappeared for 2,000 years. You say, Israel disappeared for 2,000 years? Yes. When Titus of Rome, he was a general at the time, he ended up becoming the emperor of Rome later on. But when he came into Israel in Jerusalem in AD 70, he destroyed everything. Killed over 1 million Jews. 1 million. That was a lot back then. And totally destroyed the temple. Took all its gold and silver and brought it all, and they've got it documented. I don't know if you've ever been to Rome. I've been to Rome. And they documented this thing. In fact, the Colosseum, if you've ever been to Rome, that's one of the things you see, was built by the Jewish captives that were taken in 70. That's why it's still standing, because the Jews built it. I love this part. I don't know if you know the chronology of Billy Graham's life, but Billy Graham was a preacher for a long time until 1949. Something happened in 1949. Less than a year after Israel became a nation, God put his hand on Billy Graham. That's when those revivals took place in L.A. and all around, and that's when he just, do you realize Billy Graham has reached more people for Christ than all the other people together? And he just died 2 years ago. Folks, the odds of Israel becoming a nation after being dispersed all over the world by the Romans in AD 70 are astronomical, because it's never happened anywhere else. But we never focus on it. We hear about Israel in the papers, or we read it in the papers, or we hear it on the news, and we just think, oh, okay, Israel's going through problems again. You ought to be saying Israel. Not Israel's going through problems, but Israel. Israel's a nation again. What is that saying? That's the bridegroom crying, letting all of us know he's getting much closer. Let me put it this way. In 1948, he was blocks away. 2020, he's just up the street. And nobody's even looking at it. You say, oh, it'll be another 20. I'll be dead before he returns. Okay. You know, with attitudes like that, you won't expect him to return. And when he does, because the Bible says he comes like a thief in the night, he will even fool Christians, unless you're listening for the cries. And the first humongous cry was in 1940. The most significant cry was in 1948. Listen to what Peter said in Acts chapter 3 and verse 20. He said, and he, God the Father, talking about God the Father, shall send Jesus Christ, which before was preached unto you. This is in his sermon in Acts chapter 3. Verse 21, here it is, whom the heavens must receive until the times of restitution of all things. He said, Peter said this, you don't know this, but the Israel you know right now will cease to exist in 40 years. You don't know it. Jesus talked to us about it and we didn't figure it out. But we know it now and we're passing that same information on to you. Our country is going to disappear. Our nation is going to disappear. But when it is reinstated, when the restitution of all things, which includes the nation of Israel, takes place, he says this, when it takes place, he is near. Well, that was 7 years ago. He is nearer than he's ever been. Listen to what Ezekiel said in Ezekiel 38:8. After many days, thou, talking about Russia, shall be visited. Someone's going to tap Russia on the shoulder and say, your part in the end times has come. Get ready, Russia. By the way, the end time players are all mapped out for us. And by the way, the United States isn't in there. As much as you want it to be in there, we aren't even a part of the end time scenario. We're meaningless, literally. Say, well, who are the end time players? Israel, Russia, China, Iran, Turkey. Those are your end time players. And by the way, they're all very active right now. After many days, thou, Russia, shalt be visited. Listen for it. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land, talking about Israel, that is brought back from the sword. That took place in 1848, folks. Ezekiel talked about this 600 BC. That's 2,600 years ago. He said, listen for it. When Israel disappears as a nation and they're reinstituted, listen for it. Ezekiel says, because that is when Russia will come down on that land that was brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people. Ezekiel predicted a time that there would be a day when Israel would return as a nation back from the sword, back from its destruction as a nation in AD 70. Hello, 1948. Now, I wasn't alive then. You probably were, but I wasn't alive then. 1948. Wouldn't be born for another 6 years. Listen to what Jesus said in Matthew 24:32. He said, now learn a parable of the fig tree. Jesus is saying this. By the way, the fig tree always represents Israel. Listen to Joel chapter 1, 5 through 7. Awake ye drunkards, Joel said in his day, around 800 BC, and weep and howl, all ye drinkers of wine, for it is cut off from your mouth. He said, for a nation, talking about a nation of locusts, God would use insects to destroy the Israeli crops because they weren't living for him. For a nation or a nation of locusts has come up upon my land, strong and without number, whose teeth are the teeth of a lion. They're going to devour everything. And he hath the cheek teeth of a great lion. He hath laid my vine waste and barked my fig tree. Fig tree is always Israel. So listen to what Jesus said. Matthew 24:32. Learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender. By the way, nothing more tender than a brand new baby, yes or no? Talking about the rebirth of Israel. Gentle now, easy. I mean, giving a baby is very difficult. But once that thing is out, you've got to handle that thing with care. It's tender. It's new. It's frail. And isn't that exactly what happened to Israel in 1948? Oh, just for them to be birthed was right after World War II when Hitler tried to exterminate them all. Talk about a tough birth. Talk about a breach. Talk about an impossible birth. There it was. But once she was birthed in 1948, God says, this thing is so delicate now. And by the way, if you know your history at all, and you should know your history, you should know that all the Arabs around Israel revolted. Every one of them. And went on a war path to destroy this brand new tender baby called Israel in 1948. And they kept it up until 1973, the last war the Arabs ever against that tender baby called Israel. Learn a parable of the when his branch is yet tender, the rebirth of a nation, and putteth forth leaves, that is, it begins to bud as a nation. You know that summer is nigh. He says, you'll know my return is at the door. Well, has Israel budded since 1948? Folks, Israel, with 5 million Jews, that's it. That's all that lives in Israel. They're surrounded by 250 Arabs or Muslims. There's only 5 million Jews in Israel.